UAA, College of Business and Public Policy.
Hello, I'm Dr. Darren Prokop, Professor of Logistics at the College of Business and Public Policy at the University of Alaska Anchorage. Welcome to my video interview with Steve Rebuffo, Port Director at the Port of Alaska, recorded November 14, 2018. Mr. Rebuffo, tell us a little bit about yourself and how you achieved your position of leadership at the Port of Alaska.
Well, I will tell you that I think the lesson learned for me was that you never know when you're networking. I was stationed in Alaska with at a headquarters Alaskan Command as the Director for Logistics. And as part of that job, the Director for Logistics owns the civil engineers who work real estate matters for in the joint world. So I found myself in the role of brokering a couple of land deals between the Army and the Air Force and the municipality on the military side of the fence line between the port and the base. And I did that for the 3 years that I was the Director for Logistics, and then my time was up and I left. I was gone for about 2 years, getting ready to retire, was living in Virginia, and the phone rang one day, and it was the person who was the deputy director at the port, saying, who I knew as an Army colonel who was the garrison commander and involved in all of these real estate deals. She said, hey, my husband and I are going to move to Pennsylvania because we have parents who are not doing well and want to get closer to them instead of flying home a week a month to take care of them. So I'm leaving and the job's coming open. Do you want it? And pretty easy decision. All you have to do is live in Washington, D.C. for a couple of years, driving on Interstate 95 with 1 million of your closest friends, and you want to be anywhere but there, at least in my mind. So we jumped at the opportunity and moved back up here, and that was in 2007 when I retired from active duty, and I've been at the port now for a little over 11 years, 4 years as the director.
What are some of the key facts and or statistics we ought to know about the Port of Alaska?
Well, let's boil it all back down to logistics in Alaska. If you live up here and you're a logistician, you have to think of yourself as living on an island. There's only one road that connects Alaska to the lower 48, and it goes through a foreign country. So you're limited as to the amount of goods that can come up that one road on a fairly regular basis. People who have made the drive will tell you how long it takes. And even with 2 drivers in a truck, it would be a caravan just about every day to do what gets delivered to Alaska otherwise. As a consequence, the big picture is that 90% of all the freight that comes into this state comes on the water. The Port of Alaska is the caretaker for half of that 90%. It comes up Cook Inlet and comes across the docks at Anchorage. But half of that keeps moving up and down the road and the rail system for delivery to communities that are along the road system and the rail. So we're the Port of Fairbanks, we're the Port of Wasilla, we're the Port of Palmer, we're the Port of Kenai, and on and on and on. Because it's got the infrastructure to handle that kind of volume as efficiently as you could want it to be handled, so that cost control is as good as it's going to get for living in Alaska.
That's one of the reasons, if I may guess, why the municipality of Anchorage decided to change the name of the Port of Anchorage to the Port of Alaska, since you mentioned so many other cities.
Yeah, and I think it kind of puts our responsibility and our position in a clearer light for folks that just don't think about that every day, who live outside of Anchorage, and how important this port is to them. And if something were to happen here, the impact of that is going to get felt statewide.
What components go into your calculation of service charges? Do you have a tariff schedule, or are charges made on a customer-by-customer basis?
It's a little bit of everything. We have a tariff structure. The tariff is designed, for the most part, to be where you start negotiations with customers. But we operate, our business model is the landlord. The municipality owns the real estate, and we lease the real estate to people who are interested in establishing a presence on the water near the port to conduct business. So we make some of our revenue off of the real estate lease charges. that we incur. Then we also charge what's called dockage, which is basically rental for a portion of the dock for how long you're going to be there to use it to do your business, and for the and for the length of the ship. So there's a table in the tariff that you go to, and you can calculate before you even get here what your approximate dockage charge is going to be. And then there's wharfage, which is dollars or cents on the unit of issue for the type of commodity you're bringing across the dock, whether you're bringing it in or you're shipping it out. So it's based on linear feet, tons, gallons, pounds, whatever the unit of measure is for particular commodities, and it varies. So there's unit charges for all of that, and you just multiply it by what the tonnage is. And we provide some services to users. We do snow plowing. We will water the roads to keep the dust down. We do some minor maintenance to facilities and those kinds of things. So if you're leasing the port's maintenance staff to do that kind of work for you, then there's a fee for that as well. And that's how we make our money.
And some of your most prominent customers are?
Well, let's talk to the ocean carriers first. There's two: Matson Navigation of Alaska and Tote Maritime of Alaska. They are the companies that bring the containers into the port in the volumes that we manage every week. They call religiously every week on Sundays and Tuesdays. And then we have 7 petroleum users who all have terminals down at the port, and they bring in tankers and barges for petroleum deliveries, all refined petroleum, no crude oil handling at the port. And then there's Alaska Basic Industries. Locally, everybody knows them as Anchorage Sand and Gravel. They're our big dry bulk customer, really the only tenant one that we have, and they bring in cement. And it's the cement for a little over 85% of all the construction in the state every year. So it's a pretty significant contribution to state infrastructure development.
And not many people would realize it, but you also host a lot of the aviation fuel that is pumped to Ted Stevens Anchorage International Airport. Yeah,
somewhere in the neighborhood of 85% of that fuel will come either across the dock, delivery by tanker, and then we have a pipeline that connects us to, I guess, what is now the Marathon refinery in Nikiski. So there's some delivery that comes up through the pipeline, and then there's delivery that comes by tanker and by barge, because we also handle the ultra-low sulfur diesel that is refined down at the Nikiski refinery.
Do all of your customers negotiate their particular service charges with you, knowing that you do have a tariff, or do some of them just accept your tariff and take it as given?
Well, it's a little bit of both. On the petroleum and dry bulk side of the house, folks have been living with the tariff for as long as at least I've been at the port. But we do negotiate what are called preferential user agreements with both the ocean carriers. It's a combination of an agreement that you will provide us a certain amount of volume every year so that we can at least begin to build a budget with some certainty to it. And in return for that, we're going to give you a premium rate for the kinds of goods that come in, either containerized or, in the case of tote, which is a roll-on, roll-off vessel, vehicles as eaches. And we just established special rates for these guys, and they live up to those. The rule is if you provide what you have promised, then the rate is what we've agreed to. If you don't, then there's a consequence to that, and we go to the tariff rate. In addition, what we also do with them is we base what we charge them. Well, that's wrong. Let me say it better. We charge them in the current year for the volumes they brought in the previous year. So it's not a as-you-go type of payment, which is good for them and good for us, because we'll know at the end of one fiscal year what it is we're going to see for revenue from them in the coming fiscal year, and they know what their bills are going to be in the coming fiscal year before the year even starts. So everybody can do a little bit of budget planning. And at the end of the day, both the ocean carriers have the lion's share of the real estate down there as well. So having all that arranged so that you can forecast what your charges are going to be a year in advance is a pretty helpful thing for both of us.
Certainly sounds like it. And you mentioned the roll-on, roll-off operations of Totem Ocean Trailer Express, and so I think it's fairly straightforward for the ships to come in. They lower their gangplank, and the items roll on and off. When it comes to Matson, for example, we see the big gantry cranes that do the lift-on, lift-off. Tell us about those gantry cranes. Are they owned by Matson or are they owned by the port?
Well, they are owned by the port, but there really is one almost sole operator, and that is Matson. In my time here, I've only seen them used for somebody else twice, and it was the same somebody else both times. It happened to be when a military cargo ship was at the dock conducting deployment operations. They would load the top deck with containers using the gantry cranes. But for the most part, the sole user has been Matson. Horizon Lines before they were bought out by Matson and now Matson. Because of that, the arrangement that we've made with Matson is they have responsibility now for all the maintenance. We have nobody on the port staff who has the wherewithal to maintain those cranes. The company has had a long-standing relationship with a crane maintenance operator, and they keep that arrangement, and they have a presence there all the time, so anything that has to be done to keep cranes in service is done by Matson. What we give them now is right of first refusal should there be another requesting user. They have to provide the operators. Again, the port and the municipality have no collective bargaining agreements with either longshoremen or crane maintainers. We just have a documented understanding with Matson that they'll provide those services, and we put in the tariff what those rates would be to have those services. Yeah.
And the operators of the gantry cranes during the lift-on, lift-off of the containers, those workers, are they employees of Matson or somebody else?
They're contractors to Matson. They are members of the local Longshore Union, which is the, let me see if I get, it's AILU, the Alaska Independent Longshore Union, which is a subset up here of the Teamsters, but they have no relationship with the ILWU on the West Coast, which is good for Alaska because they are more sympathetic with the Alaska community than they are with the wants and needs of the ILWU on the West Coast. So I have yet to see any kind of sympathetic strike support or slowdown support happen in Alaska when the ILWU does those kinds of things down on the West Coast. So when there was that big slowdown a few years back, there was really no impact on Alaska as a consequence of that. And I think we also have to give some thanks to the delegation for getting even the ILWU to acknowledge that you could, for all intents and purposes, starve a state if you take too hard a line with the shipping that is coming up to Alaska.
So it is fair to say that the ILWU on the West Coast, when they were doing the slowdown at LA and Long Beach, they understood that a similar slowdown in Anchorage could have much more severe consequences than it would for a state like California.
Yeah, and it's kind of hard to get to worry about the union up here, failing to remember that their families have to eat too. So there is no plan B. There's no place else you can go with those kinds of volumes to compensate for what you would lose in the short run. So we've been pretty fortunate about being somehow relieved of having to worry about those kinds of big West Coast issues having a really adverse impact up here. There was some slowing down with deliveries to Matson and Tote, and I think they got off schedule a few times as a consequence of that, but volume losses never really occurred.
Right. And speaking of schedule, it is the case, isn't it, that both Totem Ocean Trailer Express and Matson, they both deliver on Sundays and Tuesdays.
They do.
Is that a coincidence that they have those days, or is there some reason why?
I think I think most of it has to do with the Longshore schedules and contracts at the Port of Tacoma, since they both sail to Anchorage out of the Port of Tacoma. Nobody on the West Coast wants to work Sundays. Yeah. So in order to build a schedule where there's no, or weekends for that matter, to build a schedule where there's no weekend work on the West Coast, you have to arrange for deliveries up here on days that require at least one out of the two working on Sunday up here in Alaska, and that's how they sail on Thursday out of Tacoma, and they arrive here on Sunday, and then then there's whatever the other schedule is to get them here on Tuesdays. It's a 3-day sail from Tacoma to Anchorage, but they've worked all of that out, and what starts out as the business model suddenly becomes the tradition, because now the expectation in all the stores are the deliveries are going to be on Sunday and Tuesday, and the whole supply chain that you built that's at the back end of this, down in Tacoma all the way to where all those sources of supply is, to get to Tacoma in time to load to get here for Sunday and Tuesday. All of that was contractually arranged for based on the sailing dates out of Tacoma to be here on Sunday and Tuesday. So huge perturbations to change that, and it's almost etched in granite that is the way it's going to be for Alaska. And that's why when you walk in a store, if you suddenly see kind of a hole in the shelf, what the guys that stock the shelves in the stores will tell you, they'll fill that tomorrow, or we'll get the delivery on Tuesday, we'll get the delivery on Sunday, so the hole goes away. And it's what happens.
And when the vessels arrive on Sunday, for example, when do they leave the port to head back to the Port of Tacoma?
They'll leave before the end of Sunday or very early Monday. Both of the container ships that call here carry approximately the same number of containers, but there's a difference in the speed of onload and offload between a lift-on, lift-off and a roll-on, roll-off. Roll-on, roll-off tends to move a little faster because you don't have all the process of disengaging the container from the trailer that's carrying it and lifting it up and putting it on the ship, or taking the one that's coming off the ship and locking it down on the trailer. It's a little bit of a longer, more involved process. And when you're using a roll-on, roll-off, as many drivers and vehicles as you have can be working simultaneously to pull things off the ship, so you can move cargo a lot faster, and it's a big parking garage, so when the empties or the backhaul containers go on the ship, they just park them on the deck, lash them down, and off they go. So you can turn the roll-on, roll-off ship in about 9.5, 10 hours, and it takes 15 or to 16 to do the same thing for the same number of containers on the lift-on, lift-off. Not appreciably different, not so statistically different that makes one better than the other. It's just two different business models, and that's how, and that's basically the timeline. But they'll both be in either very late the night before, so Saturday night, early Sunday morning, or Monday night, very early Tuesday morning. The whistle blows to go to work at 7 a.m. on both of them. And Tote can leave sometimes between 3 and 5, and Matson will leave 10, 11 o'clock at night. But they're both, more often than not, off the dock before midnight on the Sunday or the Tuesday.
Apart from making dock space available for vessels, what other services does the Port of Alaska provide to its customers and or the community?
Sure. Well, as the landlord, it's our responsibility to make sure that the dock is safe to operate on, the plumbing works, the electricity works, the roads are safe to drive, clear of snow, clear of ice, and those kinds of things. And then we fundamentally get out of the way of the port users. We also have responsibility on the petroleum side of the house for all the plumbing from the petroleum dock into the valve yard, up to the point of demarcation or the motor-operated valves that you can electronically open and close while you're doing on dock operations to move the fuel to whoever the user is that needs to shuttle it to their plumbing from the shared plumbing that comes off the petroleum docks. So we're responsible for that, and if we can keep that operational, then we've done our part with respect to supporting the operation. But our focus does not extend past the borders of the port, so we don't make deliveries to stores downtown. That is the private sector trucking companies that have contracts with Matson and Tote, or the other delivery drivers that deliver for Crowley and AFSC out to the airport and to Sorrel and the like.
Well, of course, building on the connection to Ted Stevens Anchorage International Airport, not only are you the host of the aviation fuel coming in, a decent percentage of it, but I recall that the Port of Alaska is also the host of the Foreign Trade Zone designation for Anchorage, and that's a pretty special device that is made available to potential users at the port, at the airport, and elsewhere. About the Foreign Trade Zone?
Sure, I'm happy to. Yeah, it is, and it's an administrative service we provide. We have an attorney back in New York, a law firm back in New York that does the paperwork heavy lifting for us. But we're the clearinghouse, if you will, for any entity who is interested in establishing a foreign trade zone type operation in the state. And what's interesting about it is it could be something as small as a wall safe, or as large as petroleum storage tanks, if you will, out at the airport. And we've got a little bit of what covers the watershed that's involved in the process. And basically what a foreign trade zone does, it's kind of a duty-free shop, if you will, for commodities that you can provide a price advantage to the buyers of, based on the circumstances for how the product is used. And the best example is fuel. So we get a lot of foreign carriers, air cargo carriers, that do nothing in Anchorage but stop for fuel. And the reason why they do that is because the fuel, which is predominantly sourced from overseas, comes across the dock and it goes into the tanks out at the airport. We have a pipe that connects the port to the airport, so they get fuel deliveries at the port go out to Ted Stevens and they're in that tank. If you're a foreign flag carrier and you've picked up that fuel and you're going to a foreign destination, you pay no duty on the fuel. And the fuel that you would pay duty on is that which is left in the tank by the time you get there. So you pay no duty here. If you have an empty tank when you get to where you're going, there's no duty at all. You've bought the fuel, period. That's it. And same thing going the other way. If you're leaving a foreign country and you're stopping in Anchorage and you're fueling with foreign fuel and you're a foreign flag vessel and you're headed to a U.S. destination, the duty you pay on is that which is what's left in the tank. And the way this operates is you trade off cargo weight for fuel, and that's why everybody stops here. And they know they're going to have pretty dry tanks by the time they get where they're going. So the impact on duty on the fuel that they bought is very, very minimal. It's an advantage and it's a sales pitch that the airport can use when they're out there marketing themselves overseas. There are other type commodities that you could take advantage of the same thing with. If you're a manufacturer of bicycles and they're made in China, made in Japan, what have you, if you established an assembly plant here within the confines of the Anchorage municipality, the whole municipality really is the foreign trade zone.
Yes,
that's the construct we use.
Yes, you were able to have the entire municipality of Anchorage under your host, so to speak,
yes,
to establish a foreign trade zone anywhere, this general purpose zone, as we call it.
Right. It's what's called an alternate site framework. It was a brand new construct that was created about 7 years ago that allows you to extend the foreign trade zone border to the confines of your, in this case, the municipality, the government district that made the request. And we even have the option of extending that beyond the municipality, because we have one in Kenai. for the Tesoro refinery, and we have one in Wasilla for another manufacturer. If you can either get the make the drive into the the Anchorage inside Anchorage borders within 60 minutes of where you want to establish this zone, there's a little less heavy lift to do to establish you as what they call a subzone. So we have one in Nikiski and we have one in out in the valley as a consequence of that. So it's pretty flexible, and the paperwork, it gets turned very quickly. We don't make a lot of money off of this, but it's a service we offer that could provide a certain amount of advantage to manufacturers who can provide all the pieces parts that make it work for them. Absolutely. As a business.
Mr. Rebuffo, tell us a little bit about your reliance on government funding, federal, state, and municipal.
Sure. Well, we'll start local and we'll work our way to the federal government. We are what's called an enterprise fund of the municipality. There are 5 city departments that are either an enterprise or a utility. There's the port, Merrill Field, Solid Waste Services, Water Wastewater Utility, and Municipal Light and Power. By charter, we have the responsibility of generating sufficient revenue to cover all of our own expenses without any property tax dollars having to come down to run the operation. And we need to be able to provide back to the city a payment in lieu of taxes every year that sort of parrots a property tax that a big private sector company would supply. And we have been successful in doing that for many, many, many years. So we are not part of the tax base, or we don't rely on the tax base of the municipality to do anything down at the port. And we provide revenue back to the city every year to manage the tax cap as low as possible. And all the other enterprise and utility funds operate the exact same way. So we get nothing, per se, from the city to run operations.
And the municipality does not have any regulations on your tariff? You decide it yourself?
The tariff is determined by, we have a port commission and we have the Anchorage Assembly. As a city department, the Anchorage Assembly is our board of directors. So they have to approve everything we do, whether it's a contract for services or it's a lease or it's the tariff. But the tariff starts with the Anchorage Port Commission. The Port Commission members are appointed by the mayor, approved by the Assembly, and their responsibility is to suggest to the Assembly what the tariff structure would be. Now, we do all the work in doing all the research and putting together what we have as recommendations for what tariff rates should be. We present that to the Port Commission. The Port Commission vets it, takes a vote, and if they approve it in whole or in part, or with amendments, then we make all of those changes and put the paperwork together to present it to the Assembly, and then the Assembly approves it. So, in that context, the municipality shares part of the responsibility for establishing the rates down at the port. The heavy lifting is ours, but the ultimate responsibility for approval, disapproval rests with the Assembly. Yeah. At the state level, since we are not there's no port authority in the state of Alaska, there are no revenue streams that support ports in the state of Alaska. So any monies we would receive from the state for the port would fall into the capital budget grant arrangement that anybody else who is going to the state for capital funding for operations would have to go through. And the city puts together a capital budget request every year that they submit early in the legislative session every year. So that'll happen again here shortly. And we'll probably be in that for some amount of money as yet to be determined. But we present that to the state, and then we just kind of watch how things are going over the course of the time the legislature's in session. We may have to go down and testify to House and Senate Finance or to the transportation committees to help explain what it is that we're asking for and why, or somebody else will do that for us. It just kind of depends on who the players are in any given year. And then at the other end, you watch for what the budget is going to look like, for the next fiscal year, and you're either in it or you're not.
And is it fair to say that when the municipality changed the name to the Port of Alaska from the Port of Anchorage, it was a polite signal to Juneau that we might be worthy of some more funding?
Well, I like that term, polite signal, because that was kind of the impetus, a big part of the impetus behind it in the first place, was to get that acknowledgement. I have not experienced any pushback on that from anybody. I think there might be some other ports that are politely not saying anything, but what I always say is if you go to the Port of Los Angeles, anytime you see the logo for the Port of Los Angeles, prominently right underneath it says America's Port. Well, that doesn't offend me that they call themselves America's Port. They can stand behind that. It has more volume that crosses its docks on a yearly basis than any other port in the United States. When it comes to Alaska, we're in that same category. More volume for state support crosses our docks than in any other individual location, and I would argue in some other central locations, if you added it all together, it's still not as much as what crosses the docks in Anchorage. So I think we could stand behind Port of Alaska with an economic defense that is going to be hard to kind of beat. And as I said earlier, this stuff goes everywhere. It's not just for the Anchorage community to consume. It goes up and down the rail belt and the road system, and it even goes out to Ted Stevens Airport in volumes for air delivery to the bush. So we touch a lot of people in this state, about 85% of the population. So yeah, I think the name's kind of defendable.
And any dependency on federal sources of government funding?
Well, after the day of earmarks passed, getting money from the federal government just because, even as a national strategic seaport, for all intents and purposes, came to an end. When it comes to the U.S. Department of Transportation, and we have the local AMATS process, where
that stands for.
Let me see if I can get this right. Anchorage Metropolitan Area Transportation Solutions. Yeah, AMATS. Yeah, and that is the municipal group, and there are state representatives, state DOT representatives on that too, that build the construction plans for all of those entities that get federal funding through the formulary system that DOT manages. Roads have Federal Highway Administration, airports have the FAA, the railroads have either Federal Transit Authority or the Federal Rail Administration. Transit has the FTA. Ports have nobody. There is no federal watchdog for ports. And part of the reason why is because there are no taxes paid by ports to build a formulary. You drive on roads, you pay tolls. You buy gasoline, you pay a highway tax. You use the railroad, you pay taxes. You use the airport, there's taxes on your airline ticket. Ports don't have that infrastructure, so they bring no money to the table. Ports have what's called a Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund that the big ports have been putting money in for many years. It's somewhere in the $15 to $20 billion range. But what it's been used for, and DOT manages it, so what it's been used for by DOT for the most part is an offset to the deficit. It's never been spent. The American Association of Port Authorities has very recently, at the behest of the larger ports who are having significant issues staying competitive with the brand new big post-Panamax container ships that are being built since the Panama Canal was widened, they're struggling with being able to provide the draft to even handle those, if you can believe it. So there's dredging money. The whole point of the Harbor Maintenance Trust Fund was money for the Corps of Engineers to do dredging, but it is way more than the annual demand as it exists today requires to be given to the Corps of Engineers to do that kind of to do that kind of work. So now all the big ports on the East Coast, and it's predominantly East Coast and Gulf Coast. West Coast, for some reason, doesn't have it nearly as bad, but there are a few that do, that want to dip into this fund to cover the cost of dredging for the Corps of Engineers, or for them to contract it out themselves to be able to stay competitive. So for the longest time, ports who really didn't, the big guys really didn't want the federal government meddling in their business, are in a position where now they need the help to get into that fund to offset this money. So there will be some amount of support that comes to ports out of that fund someday. But up to this current Congress, they haven't been able to make any leeway. But there's a lot of low-level talk now that the House TNI is going to get managed by the Democrats. That some of that will break loose.
Tell us a little bit about your dealings with government regulations, federal, state, municipal, and how they impact your operations. Do you have any significant environmental regulations to comply with?
Well, let me handle let's talk the federal level first on regulations. There are none that we per se, the port, for day-to-day operations have to be concerned about enforcement on, with the exception of the security-related things. We fall underneath the Department of Homeland Security, U.S. Coast Guard, for all security matters down at the port. 33 CFR is the guiding Bible, if you will, for port security operations, and we comply with that, and are inspected frequently by the Coast Guard to ensure that compliance is there. So they don't just handle safety-related matters for vessel operations, but they also manage the security with respect to ports around the country. So we have to comply with that. From an environmental perspective, we are more impacted by the Marine Mammal Protection Act than we are the Endangered Species Act. When the Endangered Species Act, when the Cook-Inlet beluga whale was designated endangered under that, we had already been required to comply with a lot of conditions and all associated with construction operations down at the port to protect the Cook-Inlet beluga whale. Nothing new was added to us by the Endangered Species Act, bringing the Cook-Inlet beluga whale under its fold. Then there was the whole process of not only designating the species as endangered, but also establishing the critical habitat underneath the Endangered Species Act for the Cook-Inlet beluga whale. And while the area that has been designated as critical habitat for the whale, while the port is within that area there, we were granted an exclusion from the conditions of the Endangered Species Act for critical habitat in an area around the port because of the military importance of this port, and also because of the commercial significance of it and its support to the economy. So we're not excluded from any responsibility, but the more onerous pieces of it we've been excluded from because of the critical habitat exclusion.
Well, on the beluga whale, if I recall, when you're dredging or when you were doing some port expansion projects, the operations had to stop when the beluga whale were near and passing through, right? Yeah, and that is still the case. Any construction that we do in the water there has to be some accommodation for the noise created by that construction in the water, and concerns for the noise as harassment for the Cook-Inlet beluga whale. So we've taken some measures to mitigate that as much as possible. There's a zone, an exclusionary zone that's established around construction, and if whales enter into that zone while construction operations are underway, you cease operations until they leave. Now that comes at a cost.
And it could be hours. It could be the rest of the workday, depending upon the circumstances and how long it takes the whales to find their way out of that zone before you can start work again. But you're paying for workers to be there and being gainfully employed all day long, when you may get a quarter of a day, half a day of work out of them, or start, stop, and all that comes with delays.
Who manages the compliance of that regulation? Is somebody spotting the beluga whales there?
Yeah. In fact, we have to add, as part of the construction contractor's responsibilities, marine mammal observers, who are stationed at the extremities of the zone to basically watch the water and look for whale sign and notify the construction foreman when they have to cease operations, because the whales are either right at the entry point of the zone or 3 minutes away, 5 minutes away, what have you. So they know when a good stop point would be before you are you're penalized with what they call a take. It does not necessarily mean you harmed the animal physically, but a take, when you break the rule, you are penalized with a take, and you only get so many before you have to stop completely until you can consult with National Marine Fisheries and come up with a plan to never let that happen again.
And who hires the observers?
It's part of the construction contractor's responsibility to provide that service.
I see. Okay.
And there are companies that do that. A lot of them are retired NIMS employees, so they kind of know the game to begin with, and they've developed quite the little cottage industry for marine mammal observers. And the good news is they know exactly what they're looking for, and they know a lot more about behavior than the guy off the street who's never done it before. So I guess you're getting what you paid for. Whether or not you really want to pay for that is a story and a conversation for another day. But if you're gonna pay, if you need the expertise, it's good to have people that walk in the door with it.
Absolutely. So those are about the biggest impacts at the federal level, right?
Yeah, and I, off the top of my head, cannot think of any state kinds of regulations that impact our operations. And because we have this landlord business model down there, whether there are any that affect the ocean carriers and they don't share that with us, or any of the port users for that matter. And I'm sure there's Department of Environmental Conservation regulations if we have oil, a petroleum spill or a petroleum mishap of some kind. All that is reportable through the state channels. So in that respect, yeah. And from an OSHA perspective, everything we do has an OSHA implication to it.
And OSHA stands for?
Occupational Safety and Health Administration, I'm sure it is, and the state has an OSHA branch. And if if something happens down at the port, if there's a mishap or an accident or something like that, it is reported to OSHA, and they will come in and do an investigation on it. We had one recently where doing some repair work in a bathroom in one of the older buildings, and we found asbestos in the wallboard. So you break the surface on that, and now you have an asbestos issue that you have to manage, and that is reportable. So we had to go through all that drill with OSHA, and so that required a little bit of remedial training for the port maintenance staff on how to deal with asbestos repairs and those kinds of things. And DEC, if we have a fuel spill during petroleum operations on the dock, whether it gets in the water or not, it's a reportable to DEC. So
DEC stands for?
Department of Environmental Conservation. ADEC is what it is up here. So it's the Alaska Department of Environmental Conservation, and we report all those things to them. It turns out that everybody who had a dog in a fight will make a report to DEC, because everybody's got that in their checklist to do. Sure. I can remember early on in my time there, we did not. I said, well, why are we reporting it to DEC? Everybody else who actually is doing the operation is reporting it, and I got my hand slapped, because everybody's supposed to report it, whether you had a hand in it happening or not. So who knew? Now I know. So we're a little bit smarter going forward.
What about regulations on your operations at the municipal level?
I think The municipal rules that we have to pay the most attention to are all the administrative policies and procedures that any city government office has to comply with. There's municipal code, so everything we do we have to do in accordance with municipal code. We have no independent ability to go out and contract. There's a purchasing office has a process. It's established in code. We have to follow that. So, in that respect, we have to be compliant with all things municipal code for all the operations that we do down there. So we operate as close to being a private sector business entity as we possibly can, but understanding that there are limits to how independent we are, because code is going to require us to do things a little bit different than the private sector would be allowed to do.
And that model has been in place since the foundation of the Port of Anchorage, now the Port of Alaska.
Yeah.
Right? Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
And the Port of Alaska came into being when?
Well, this past October was 1 year.
Mm-hmm.
So
and the Port of Anchorage that it came from started when? When did the...
Well, September 1961 was when the ribbon was cut on the little dock area that was at the time the Port of Anchorage. Yeah.
And 3 years later, a big event impacted.
A huge event happened that impacted what was going to be a little regional facility where the vision was to not have to be so reliant on everything going into Seward. Here was an option to be able to bring cargo directly into Anchorage for Anchorage. And as you said, 1964, the March 1964 earthquake happened, and it changed the world. We found out kind of, in the worst way you could possibly want to find anything out, that the Anchorage port survived the earthquake for a couple of reasons. Number one, it was only 3 years old at the time, so it was relatively fresh and new. And the second big reason was because way up here at the top of Cook Inlet, we're tsunami proof. It wasn't the earthquake that did the most devastating damage in Whittier and Seward and Homer and Valdez. It was the tsunami that came afterwards. So the wave that went over the Homer Spit at 14 feet was a ripple by the time it made it all the way up Cook Inlet. And that wasn't just dumb luck. That is, it's the geography of the inlet, how it gets wide and narrow and deep and shallow. It just took all the energy out of the wave before it made it up here. And we've kind of confirmed all of that with the seismologists and the experts to say that under similar circumstances today, the exact same behavior would happen with respect to a tsunami.
Yeah. Tsunami proof, and yet some of the largest tidal flows in the world at the Port of Alaska.
Yeah, and it kind of I give credit to the businesses that operate the port for making that a non-issue for them, but it's kind of fun to watch when you live in a place where you watch the tide, 4 tide changes a day, which is in and of itself unusual in a lot of places, and it's 2 highs and 2 lows, and the difference between the two can be anywhere from 28 to 35 feet, depending on the time of year. And you can explain that to people, and it's kind of hard to visualize in your head, but when you actually can watch a big container ship disappear below the dock and then rise up above it, or even a cruise ship, which is even more interesting to watch, where all those portholes on the side of the ship are below the dock, and then they're above the dock, and then they're below the dock again before, or what have you, before they leave. It gives you an appreciation for the challenges of managing logistics operations through the tide. It costs money to be able to have to stop. So both Matson and Tote have business models that allow them to continue through the tide cycle to do all the onloads and offloads. So it makes them as reasonable a place to go as any place that has 3 or 4 foot tides or no tides at all, because it doesn't stop them from doing operations. It's the same thing on the petroleum docks. We use hoses that are designed at lengths that allow you to keep operations on a tanker or a barge going through the huge tide cycles and not have to disconnect and wait for it to be safe again to reconnect.
And that tide cycle is all year round. So in
Yeah.
the winter, you have not only the tide cycle, but you have these ice flows.
Yeah, you have the challenge of ice, but the tide cycle, the big tide changes make the ice, for all intents and purposes, a non-issue as well. And the reason for that is because the water's always moving, nothing can freeze solid. And the water's always moving because the tide is in, the tide is out. It's up and it's down. And all of Upper Cook Inlet is fed by glacial runoff. So there's a silt content in the water that creates very, very brittle ice and not very thick ice anyway. So put those two combinations together and it gives you a very large slushy with some big pans of ice, but nothing so onerous as you need an icebreaker or an icebreaker class vessel to use this port. And the tug operators who have worked here for years know exactly how to get that ice away from the dock when you're bringing a ship in so that you're not trapping those big pans of ice between the hull and the fendering. It's all moved out of the way and the ship comes in and it traps nothing. And then they run along the outsides before they leave to break up what ice might be forming on the outsides there, so the vessel can safely pull away and get out into clearer water. Yeah, it's the experience of the mariners that operate up here, and the tide cycles and the brittleness of the ice keep us open.
And that raises a lot of challenges, however, for your dock, the wharf, piles themselves. How much of the dock at the Port of Alaska right now is the original dock from 1961?
Somewhere between 25 and 30% of it is the original. Yeah, the rest of it has all been added in stages since 1964.
And what are the current impacts on these piles right now underneath the dock?
Well, they're beginning to show their age. Well, I take that back. They've been showing their age now for the better part of the last 10 years, and it's a pretty significant corrosion problem that is pervasive throughout the facility. There's not a piling that supports the dock that is untouched by corrosion.
Even the ones that have been built past 1964?
Even the ones that have been built past 1964. Yeah, and in some instances, parts of even the most newest part of the facility are in worse shape than some of the parts of the facility that were built earlier than that because of failures in the cathodic protection system that was installed on those areas there. What not added as part of the original structure was a suppressed current cathodic protection system, and that's. I'm going to practice a little science, without a license right now. I'm a marketing major, not an engineering major. But if you put electrical current to that steel that is in the water, it slows down the corrosion process because of the pluses or minuses in the between the water, what the water is and what the steel is. You can significantly slow down the process. But if you begin to get disconnected piling from that system, then those that are disconnected become sacrificial to the rest. So you can literally speed up the corrosion on those because they're off the protection system, and that has happened in a couple of places. And that's because we've slapped this all on. So if you get underneath the dock now and you look, you can see all the wires that run to all the piling that are connected to what you call anode sleds, which is supposed to be the sacrificial part that is down in the water. That is supposed to be what corrodes away and saves the big port. But once that wiring gets disconnected, that doesn't happen anymore, or it won't happen at the rate it was planned for anymore. And so instead of having to go back out and just replace the anode sled, which is a hell of a lot cheaper than fixing all the piling at the dock. You're stuck with fixing all the piling on the dock, and that's kind of where we are right now.
So is this dock in danger of falling into the water?
Yeah, I think it is. We do the best we can with the financing that we have and with the revenues that we create to stay as far ahead of the adverse impacts of the real adverse impacts of corrosion as we possibly can. We have a maintenance program on an annual basis where we pick the worst between 150 and 300, depending upon how much money we have, piling that need to have some kind of reinforcement done to them. And the reinforcement that we do is we put steel jackets around the piles that we fill with concrete grout that provide structural integrity to that piling, so the piling continues to behave like it was originally intended to behave. It will allow us to continue to support the operational loads we need on the dock to stay open, but it's done nothing for seismic survivability. So we still have an issue with respect to an earthquake. If another one as significant as the one in 1964 ever happened again, at least right now, then we would lose the facility in spite of the fact that we put all these piles on it. But if Mother Nature leaves us alone, we can at least continue to keep operations going on the dock. But those are a one-time fix. Once those corrode, like the rest of the piling corrodes, and the earliest ones that we have put on are fast approaching that point where they're not going to be of as much use as they were when they were originally installed. And you can't take them off and put new ones on because there'll be nothing left underneath, and you can't put another one over that one. You've got to take more drastic measures, which is replace the facility.
And by replacing the facility, that basically means to move the docks somewhere else and then tear down the old dock.
Tear down the old docks, yeah. First build new, and then tear down the old in whatever logical sequence it takes to do that. But it's not an all at the same time kind of operation either, because of all the economic indicators that we talked about earlier. There's really no place else for these ships to go. There is no place else on the mainland part of Alaska that has container cranes. They have them in Kodiak and they have them in Dutch Harbor, but you can offload cargo there. You can't drive it to here from there. You'd have to ship it again. And there's no other ports that have the gantry cranes that we have that provide the most efficient offload operation. Could they potentially go somewhere else? If there is a someplace else to go, they could, but the offload operation would be significantly degraded, and the time it would take to do it would be far more than 12 to 15 hours that we experience here. So there's going to be that consequence of a more stretched out and less flexible supply chain to provide the same service. You'd never see it in the same amount of time.
So the the dock needs to be replaced.
It does.
Is there a dock expansion plan on the books, and if so, is it funded?
Well, it's not an expansion plan. If you look at, if you step back and take a good look at the economics, the port we have is plenty big enough. So expanding it for any kind of future growth, just in case, you can't build a business case for that, and it would make this far more expensive than it would need to be. What we have decided, looking at the business case and looking at the engineering requirements, is that replacing in kind, replacing it with the same size, and quite frankly, you can even get a little bit smaller than what it is we have now, and still be okay, is plenty to support the business that we have. One of the things we never looked at before, but started to look at it about 5 years ago, is utilization rate. Just how often are we managing ships at the dock? And when you take a look back, 10 years worth of activity here at the port right up to today, and you do the math, the utilization rate on the dock is between 35 and 40%. Which means between 60 and 65% of the time, there's really nothing going on. So how much port do you, honest to God, need? We support 85% of the state population. So let's just do some easy algebra. That's about north of 500,000 people that we can touch and point to and say, no kidding, your livelihood, your ability to eat, put gas in your car tank, and buy new clothes for your kids is because we're here. 85% of the population we can say that to. But we all only eat so much. And go put gas in our tanks once a week. If you have a big gas guzzling truck, maybe twice. Go buy new clothes only so often. We support that with 4 container ship port calls a week, and nobody questions where all that stuff came from that they find on the store shelves because it's working so well. Yeah. Until the population quadruples, yeah, then you might start looking at whether or not you have enough port. In the meantime, you just keep adding port calls to the same size facility that you have. And that's how you solve the problem. So needing anything bigger than what we have now, no. So expansion is a term that we stuck back, way in the back of our heads, and that's going to be somebody else's problem, 50, 60, 75 years from now. The problem that we have now is a facility the size that it is, right-sized, if you will, for the job that it does, that has a lifespan on it of maybe another 10, 12, 15 years. What has kept us going for so long is that 35 and 40% utilization rate. We don't punish this facility. It gets a chance to take a breath. We're not hammering the fendering system with ships every single day. We don't have tankers and cargo ships queued up out in the harbor waiting for a spot at the dock. We can manage the flow and we can manage the use. And there are still days we'll look out the window and there's nothing going on. So it's plenty big enough. But that doesn't solve the problem for you when corrosion is at the heart of the matter. And that's what you have to deal with.
So is there a plan on the books to build a new dock, for example, for Matson to use for its lift-on, lift-off?
There is a Port of Alaska modernization program that has been established. And it's a end-to-end replacement of the facilities, part of which is trying to accommodate as best we can afford the needs of all the current customers. We need new petroleum docks. We need a new facility for Alaska Basic Industries, Anchorage Sand and Gravel, to offload, to offload their cargo ships when they bring them in. We need a new facility for Matson to be able to continue to do it. They're doing the same for tote. I mean, it is as close to an in-kind replacement as you can get to, but also acknowledging the fact that this place was built in the late 50s, early 60s, and the state of the industry has dramatically changed. Yeah. And when it was built in the 50s and 60s, there was no standard for marine terminal construction. So they did, the best they could, with what they had. So we have piling that are, 36 inches in diameter at most, that are hollow, that are driven into the mud, not into the hard packed material way down there, just driven into the mud. So they're resting on the squishy stuff that, if there is another earthquake, is going to go with it, go with everything else. We didn't have to think about sea level rise 57 years ago. Resiliency, was probably in the dictionary, but it wasn't applied to structures of many kinds. But all of that now has to be factors that we consider when you're building something where there's such a high expectation that if there is, God forbid, another earthquake the size of the 64 earthquake or worse, doesn't make the place go away. That it's there to be at the heart of whatever recovery operations are going to be needed to get the state back on its feet should something as devastating as what happened in 64 happen again.
So the port modernization plan, is it still being discussed at the political level, or has it been funded and it's proceeding?
Well, it's being discussed at every level, and it has not been funded in total. We're looking at something that is a price tag north of $1 billion to do that. That's a number that frightens Alaskans because they don't hear that kind of thing before, and most of us grew up in an era where, there were earmarks. So you could get $100 million plus on a fairly regular basis out of your delegation in Washington, D.C. And or we were flush with oil money. So the state had the opportunity to provide big chunks of money to do this. But the economics now is so vastly different. You know, the challenge for us is going to be $1.5 billion construction project where there's no certainty of any federal money, or there's no certainty that the state can consistently contribute in numbers big enough to assist, but has to get built, has to happen somehow. So it forces us to relook at what the at what the rates are down at the port, and what, if anything, we have to do to them, or what kinds of equity sharing, public-private partnership arrangements we would have to go into with the port users in order for all of us to be able to make this happen as quickly as we can and finance the whole thing.
So that's possible. Is it possible through a public-private partnership with your customers and others, it could be funded without state, federal, or local kick-in of money?
Well, it happens in other places. So I think the answer is yes, but don't breathe a sigh of relief. I mean, because at the end of the day, there's going to be some consequence to that. I mean, some of it's given up control. You know, how much control does the municipality want to divest itself of if a private investor comes in and says, I'll take care of this for you? And because sometimes that comes with and in 30 years or 40 years when I've recovered my investment, I'll give you the keys back. But in the meantime, it's mine. And does anybody, is there an appetite for that? I don't know. Nobody's been knocking on the door making those kinds of offers to us. I think there are hybrids in between that and totally going it alone that are going to have a higher probability of success. But all of those negotiations have just recently started with the port users, because we have to have serious conversations with them about what it is we are. Based on what we have designed to their needs, this is what it's going to cost. This is what we have to cover that cost. It's not enough. There is going to be a difference. How are we going to raise that difference? Because, first we have to all agree that you have to raise that difference, because you can't afford to do nothing. And if you agree you can't afford to do nothing, then please be part of the solution that helps us get to where we need to be to make this happen.
Right.
Yeah.
And is it fair to say then that even with the 30% capacity utilization at the port, we're living on borrowed time with this current?
Oh, yeah, we are. And you never know when Mother Nature's going to deal you the next big event that screws up any timeline you think you might have. But if she leaves us alone, as I said, I think we're in the 10 to 15 year range before we're going to have to start closing down parts of the dock because they just can't support the operational loads anymore. And every pile has been jacketed, and we are at the point now, we're at the end of life for those jackets. So the weight that piece of the dock is able to support it can't be guaranteed anymore. And it could be in an area where one of Tote's ramps is sitting on the trestles, so maybe they're down to 2 ramps instead of 3. Maybe they're down to 1 instead of 3. Maybe you're limited to how much dock you can keep Matson ship at, so your area of operation for the cranes is narrowed down. And the driving so maybe you'll give up efficiency before you can have to give up an operation completely. All of that will come at a cost to consumers.
How do you measure success in your business? Does the Port of Alaska use any key performance indicators?
Well, let's see. The snarky answer is, if my phone's not ringing off the hook with people complaining, we must be doing a good job. But that is not the total litmus test for success. The fact that people don't wonder where stuff, how stuff got to store shelves, is a big part of the success story of the port. I can't take credit for that. The port staff can't take total credit for that. We'll take some, but the supply chain operators get the lion's share of the credit for being able to make that happen, because it just amazes me in this world where it takes very little to upset the norm, that it is so infrequent that the norm gets upset, because we don't have stories on the news every night about stores running out of food, or frozen food departments empty in Costco, or those kinds of things. We get them very, very, very infrequently, and to our detriment that it doesn't happen frequently, because we have a short memory span around here. Fix the problem and nobody remembers that it was even there 6 months ago. And that's sort of what we suffer from when it comes to people appreciating the long-term reasons why issues happened, and at the root of it, what you got to fix.
Do you have any key performance indicators? Any numbers you look at on a daily, weekly, monthly basis just to measure success?
I look at tonnage. We watch the trends in the tonnage that comes across the dock. Tonnage drives what our revenue is going to be in subsequent years because of the way we do calculations down there. It signals to me the health of our tenants and what their ability will be going down the road to continue to provide the revenue streams we need to keep doing our business. It really all hinges on that. Yeah. Now I also watch what our internal expenses are, because our margin's pretty narrow. We make about $14 million a year. They're between $13 and $14 million a year in revenue. Our expenses used to run on average about $10 million a year. Now they're upwards of 12 and 13 million, because we are entirely covering the cost of the litigation that we are underway with the Maritime Administration because of the failed expansion project.
That was from a few years ago.
It used to be a few years ago. Now, God, if I think back on it now, it's almost 10 years ago that all went down. But we're in litigation with that, and that comes at a cost. So our margin for being able to have a safety pad for a big infrastructure issue that pops up just in the normal scheme of things, and we have them all the time. The storm drain system is old, so we'll have storm drains, sections of them collapse, and sometimes they collapse in the most inopportune place, because that's on the traffic flows for all the vessels that are coming on and off the ships. So we have to jump on that as quickly as possible. We can do some of it in-house, but then we have to always contract for outside help if we want to make a timeline to get things back up and running pretty fast. So we have to have the financing to do that, and that's part of our budget. So if we're not controlling the expenses for just operating the port that we have, and watching that piece of it as well as watching where the revenue is coming from, then we're dropping the ball. So we pay attention to that as well.
Okay. What's it like to run the Port of Alaska? Could you walk us through a typical day on your job?
I'm a retired Air Force guy. Who knew that this would be where I would wind up? But I'm a logistician, and logistics and moving stuff on airplanes is not totally dissimilar than moving stuff on a ship is. Some of the back shop work is markedly different, but the mission is pretty much the same. So I've been loving it. I really have, and I got an office with the best views in town, and so I don't share that too much. So limit the viewers on this, so that
I've seen that view. It is
so I can keep my office for a little bit longer. But my day is, I've got a lot of good people whose jobs are very important. So I see mine as, running interference for them so that they can continue to do what they're doing, and without the roadblocks that government tends to throw up in your face, whether you like it or not, because the bureaucracy is what it is. I tell people every day, the person with the most free time on the port staff is me. So there's a lot that I could do to take pressure off of other staff members so that they can continue to do their thing as unfettered by the outside distractions as possible.
How many staff members do you have?
There's 23 of us. 13 of the 23 are the maintenance guys who operate 3 shifts. And the rest of us are the support staff. There's 2 clerical. That one is our reception effort for us, but she's also our accounts payables clerk. And then we have a accounts receivables clerk, and then the rest of us manage maintenance, operations, safety, finance, port engineering, and the port modernization program. And our external affairs, our outreach folks who will help, at least this year I think, are going to help us put together how we reach out to the legislature. And we also need to take our story on the road. Yesterday, Jim, you've met Jim, was on a teleconference with the Fairbanks Economic Development Corporation.
And Jim is your external relations?
He's our external relations guy, yeah. And he takes the message outward, or he and I will divide the labor when it comes to taking the message outward, because sometimes you got to be in a couple of different places during the same period of time. Tomorrow, I'm going to be on a panel at the Alaska Municipal League, talking about infrastructure issues in Alaska and the cost of infrastructure. So this is kind of timely.
Mr. Rebuffo, looking into the future, what would you say is the biggest challenge facing the Port of Alaska? What is its biggest opportunity?
Well, the biggest challenge that I see now is, in fact, putting together the plan of finance to finish this modernization program. It's going to be a huge effort, and we in-house down at the port just don't have the skill sets to do that without some help. So we're leaning very heavily on the city, the CFO's office at the city level to put us in touch, or put the municipality in touch with all the right people. It's one thing to make the policy decisions on where you're going to go with this. It's another thing to dot the I's and cross the T's and what have to be contractual arrangements with all your users, so that you have a plan that you can take to a bank that they can look at and say, yeah, okay, that makes sense. You need how much money? We will take the risk of loaning it to you. They don't just do it because you're a nice guy or a pretty face. You've really got to have done the back shop work, and that's going to be the big challenges going forward. The biggest opportunities that we have are, we're going to build a port when we're done with this that is state of the industry, that is resilient, that provides everybody who has an expectation that it's going to be there in the worst of times, a facility that will in fact answer the mail there. But we need them to take a step back and don't kibitz, don't criticize, and appreciate the fact that when you live in a state with less than 1 million people, it ain't cheap.
Yes, and you expect this new dock, when it's built, this new port, to resist a 64-sized earthquake,
or more.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, that is the goal. I mean, at the base level, the whole thing will be designed to withstand an earthquake that similar to the one in 1964, and portions of it more than that.
Is there anything else, Mr. Rebuffo, you'd like to tell us as we study the Port of Alaska?
Well, we have we see our business operations having three different missions. We have regular commerce, that which keeps store shelves filled, gasoline stations open, and car dealerships in business, and everything that people want to support their daily lives. We have to support that mission. Our second mission is the resiliency mission. We have to be able to be around through the worst that Mother Nature can throw at us, so that we're available to be part of all these recovery plans. I mean, you look at the FEMA recovery plans, you look at the state recovery plans. The assumption is that there's a Port of Alaska there that if you can get to it, you can stage your recovery operations out of it, and it would serve the purpose that it served in 1964 when Sealand had no place else to go because there was no Seward, and the only place they could come was Anchorage, and that's how, that's kind of how the whole big, supply chain business that is now what Anchorage manages happened, because there was just flat no place else to do it all, and we've grown as a community since then. And we have a military mission. We support the Department of Defense, which comes with no money, by the way. And that's a whole other conversation if you care to have it. But at the end of the day, the DoD has an expectation that we are there to support their mission, particularly the Army, for deployments and redeployments to anywhere in the world. We're not an Arctic port. We're the closest full-service port that they're going to find to the Arctic. But getting stuff from here to there is, it's a challenge. That's going to be a logistics challenge for somebody else to manage. But that is a big part of our mission as well. We would like to think that those agencies who have an appreciation for wanting to have those missions continue and be sustainable will help us fund this thing. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Steve Rebuffo. It was a very good discussion. Thank you for all the work you do at the Port of Alaska.
You're welcome, Darren. This is fun.
Thank you very much. I'm sure you'll agree that the Port of Alaska plays a critical role in the Alaska economy and beyond. Thanks for watching.
Visit us at business.uaa.alaska.edu.